You have felt it before, that quiet certainty that something is happening, something larger than the word coincidence can hold. Not a hunch, not wishful thinking, a recognition. Something inside you already knows the difference between random and designed. You've been in a moment, ordinary, unremarkable on the surface, and something shifted. A name appeared, a door opened, a thought arrived exactly when it was needed. And the first thing most people do with that moment is explain it away. They call it luck. They call it timing. They move on, but something in you didn't move on, because you're here. Think about how many times you've dismissed something real, because you had no framework to hold it. You felt the pull. You noticed the pattern, and then you talked yourself out of it. That is not a small thing. That is the central drama of a conscious life. The question has never been whether these moments are real. The question is why so few people are willing to follow them somewhere. There is a version of your life running underneath the one you can see. It has been running since before you understood what a pattern was. It does not announce itself with noise. It speaks in repetition, in timing, in the things that keep returning. The same type of person, the same kind of obstacle, the same feeling in the chest before the same kind of loss. And you've called it bad luck or personality or circumstance. But what if none of those were the right name? What if the pattern was always trying to tell you something specific, and the only reason it kept repeating was because it hadn't been heard yet? That is what this transmission is about. Not coincidence, not fate in the passive, resigned sense of the word. A process, active, structured, running beneath perception like a current beneath still water. The Pleiadian consciousness, the field of awareness that some call guidance, others call higher mind, does not intervene in your life the way you might imagine. It does not override your choices. It does not break the laws of your experience. What it does is organize. It arranges signal within the noise you're already living inside. And the arrangement has a logic. That logic is what you've been feeling without having language for it. Here is what most explanations get wrong. They frame these patterns as external events reaching in to touch you. A meaningful song on the radio. A stranger's words that land too precisely. A dream that maps onto your waking life. People treat these as if reality is occasionally whispering, but the Pleiadian perspective, and this is where the understanding shifts, is that your consciousness is not the receiver. It is the transmitter. The arrangement you keep experiencing is not being sent to you from somewhere else. It is being generated by something in you that operates below your conscious awareness. A frequency, a dominant internal state, a version of yourself that your mind has accepted as fixed. And that version keeps producing the same signal, and the world keeps reflecting it back. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. Your nervous system has a baseline. Your identity has a shape. Your expectations have weight and direction. And all of that, moving through time, creates recognizable patterns. Patterns that look like fate, but are actually feedback. The Pleiadian transmissions describe this with a precision that most spiritual language skips over. They do not say, trust the universe. They say, understand what you are broadcasting and why. Because if you don't understand the signal, you will keep reading the reflection as if it were the source. You will keep trying to change the mirror instead of what stands in front of it. Let that settle for a moment. How many of your repeating patterns, the ones you've blamed on timing, on other people, on the world, were actually reflections of something you had not yet examined in yourself? That is a hard question, not because the answer is complicated, because the answer is close. Closer than most people are comfortable looking. There's a particular way this feels when it starts to land, a mix of recognition and resistance. Part of you opens, part of you pushes back, and the part that pushes back usually speaks first. But I didn't choose this. I didn't want this to keep happening. And that is true. You didn't choose it consciously. But consciousness is not only what you choose with your attention. It is also what you carry without noticing. The beliefs you have never questioned. The identity you have never put down. The deep cellular sense of what is possible for someone like you. That last one. Sit with that. Someone like me. Not people in general. Not theoretically. Someone with your specific history, your specific wounds, your specific picture of how the world works. That picture is not neutral. It is not just a perspective. It is a set of coordinates. And your reality keeps arriving exactly at those coordinates. This is the process the Pleiadian transmissions are pointing to. Not a universe that rewards the deserving and punishes the unaware. A field that responds to signal, consistently, without judgment, without exception. You're always in relationship with this field. The question is whether that relationship is conscious or automatic. And here is what most people in this space never quite say directly. The moment you think you're working on your frequency while still holding the same inner picture of who you are, you're not changing the signal. You're decorating it. Positive affirmations layered over an unchanged identity. Visualization practiced inside a self-concept that has not shifted. It produces a kind of spiritual effort that exhausts itself. Because the effort is real, but the foundation hasn't moved. The Pleiadian framework names this clearly. Intensity is not the same as alignment. You can want something with tremendous force and still be broadcasting something incompatible with it. You can meditate daily and still be organized around a version of yourself that the new reality cannot reach. This is not failure. This is mechanics. And mechanics, once understood, can be changed. That is the difference between people who shift and people who stay in the same loop with better vocabulary. The ones who shift are not more spiritual. They are not more gifted. They are not working harder. They have simply stopped editing the surface and started looking at the structure beneath it. Here. Notice this right now. Something in you is either relaxing or tensing as you follow this. That response is not random. It is data. If something is tightening, it is because a part of you already suspects this is true about your own situation and hasn't wanted to look at it directly. That tension is not opposition. It is recognition pretending to be resistance. You have been interpreting the pattern as something happening to you. That interpretation has been shaping everything. What comes next in this transmission will ask you to look at the structure, the actual mechanics of what you've been running, not to collapse it into blame, not to make yourself wrong, to finally see it clearly enough to do something different. Because that is what the Pleiadian transmissions are preparing people for. Not comfort, not consolation, readiness. And readiness begins the moment you stop calling the pattern a coincidence and start asking what it's made of. What you've been feeling isn't a glitch in your experience. It is the experience trying to communicate. And it has been waiting patiently, precisely, for you to be ready to listen differently. There is more structure to this than one transmission can fully carry. The Pleiadian perspective on consciousness, identity, and the mechanics of how reality organizes itself goes deeper than what fits inside a single session. If something in you has already shifted while listening, if the recognition has already started, I want to invite you to take the next step in your own understanding. I have put together a digital book prepared specifically for people at this point in their awareness. People who already sense the pattern, who already know there is a structure they haven't fully seen yet. It is called The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness. This book is not a collection of affirmations. It is not a motivational guide. It is a map of the game being played at the level of consciousness, of the forces that organize experience, and of the exact mechanics that keep most people cycling inside the same field while believing they are moving forward. What you feel when you read it is not inspiration. It is the particular clarity of seeing something that was always operating, finally described with enough precision to act on. The link to download The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness is in the first pinned comment below this video. I want to be direct with you. Material that maps the deeper structure of consciousness, that names the game without softening it, rarely stays available without pressure. The access may not remain open indefinitely if you're watching this now. Don't wait for a better moment. The moment you're in is the one that brought you here. Download it. Read it with the same quality of attention you brought to this transmission. And if something in those pages confirms what you already knew but had never seen written down, leave one word in the comments. That word is awake. It won't need explaining. The ones who are ready will recognize it. So you left one word in the comments, or you felt the pull too. Either way, something shifted. And now, the real work of this transmission begins. Because what comes next is not more comfort. It is more precision. The pattern you've been living inside has a mechanism, and that mechanism has a name. Most people who arrive at this kind of awareness, who recognize the loop, who feel the signal, do one thing immediately. They start trying harder, more intention, more visualization, more conscious effort applied to the same structure that's been running underneath them the whole time. And here is what the Pleiadian transmissions say about that move. It is not wrong. It is just aimed at the wrong layer. You can increase effort on the surface all you want. The surface will absorb it without changing, because the thing doing the generating is not on the surface. It is in the decisions you don't notice you're making, the micro choices, the small withdrawals, the way you edit yourself before anyone even has a chance to respond. This is the layer most people never reach. Not because it is hidden, but because it is so familiar it feels like personality. Let me give you a specific picture. Someone recognizes they keep attracting the same kind of relationship, same dynamic, different face. They do the work, they journal, they set intentions, they raise their standards out loud, and then, in the actual moment, they soften the boundary just slightly. They over-explain. They make it easier for the other person. Not because they're weak, because something in them needs the situation to stay manageable. That small softening is not random. It is the mechanism speaking. It is an internal protocol. One that says, keep the familiar architecture intact, even if it costs you. And the cost accumulates slowly, so slowly that by the time it's visible, it feels like fate. This is what the transmissions call sabotage. But not sabotage in the dramatic conscious sense. It is quieter than that. It happens in real time, in the body, before the mind catches up. A conversation where you almost said the thing and didn't. A decision where you saw both doors and chose the one that required less of the version of you that's still unproven. An opportunity that arrived, and something in you found a reason it wasn't the right time. Notice, none of those moments felt like self-destruction. They felt like wisdom, like discernment, like being careful. That is the precise feature of this mechanism. It wears the clothing of protection. It tells you it is keeping you safe. It tells you it is being realistic. It tells you you are simply not being naive. And from inside the loop, there is no obvious way to tell the difference between genuine caution and self-limitation pretending to be caution. That is why the loop persists in people who are otherwise intelligent, aware, and working on themselves. It is not a lack of effort. It is a case of mistaken identity, where the protector and the saboteur are wearing the same face. The Pleiadian framework has a specific way of looking at this. They describe what you might call a dominant frequency, Not just a thought pattern, but a whole orientation. An orientation that includes what you automatically believe is available to you, how much space you allow your own desires to take up, what kind of response you expect when you finally ask for what you need. All of that running in the background. All of that shaping what the field receives as your actual signal. And here is the thing about that orientation. It is not random. It was formed. It was learned. At a specific age, in a specific environment, with specific information about what was safe to want. You built a picture of the world, and then you started living in the picture instead of the world. That's worth pausing on. The picture you built at 7 or 12 or 22, it still has operational authority over your choices. Not because you are stuck, because no one ever asked you to examine it as a picture. It felt like truth. It felt like the way things are. And so you carried it forward, quietly, into every room you've entered since. Now, here is where this gets specific and uncomfortable. The behaviors that maintain the loop are not usually dramatic. They are small, repeated, and they feel like the opposite of sabotage. Checking yourself before speaking, anticipating the other person's response before they've given it, modifying what you want before you even say it out loud, so it becomes something more acceptable, smaller, more apologetic, less inconvenient. This happens so fast it barely registers, but the field registers it. The signal registers it, because what gets transmitted is not what you intended to communicate. It is what the body actually sent, including all the parts you edited out. Stop for a second. How often do you arrive at a moment of potential, a real opening, and immediately begin managing it down to a size that feels survivable? That managing is not caution. That managing is the mechanism, and it has its own logic. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Keep you inside a range that feels familiar, even when what is familiar is no longer what you want. The Pleiadian transmissions describe a kind of internal weather system, a set of conditions that generate the same climate over and over, regardless of what is planted. You can plant different seeds, new intentions, new affirmations, new goals. But if the climate hasn't changed, the yield will be the same. And the climate is not made of thoughts. It is made of habitual responses, the body's automatic answer to exposure, to risk, to the possibility of being seen wanting something. This is the layer that most inner work never reaches. Not because it can't, because it requires something most frameworks don't ask for. Not more effort, not more belief. An honest account of what you have actually been doing, not what you have been intending, what you have said and then unsaid, what you reached for and then pulled back from, what you allowed yourself to want in private and then reduced before anyone could disappoint you. That account is not comfortable, but it is the only thing that makes the next part possible, because the transmissions are not asking you to want more. They are asking you to stop interrupting yourself before the signal even leaves you. There is a difference between blocking the signal from outside and collapsing it from within. Most people who feel stuck are not being blocked by the universe. They are interrupting their own broadcast before it reaches any frequency. This is not a spiritual failure. It is a learned reflex, and learned reflexes can be unlearned, but only once you can see them clearly enough to name them. Which is exactly what the next layer of this transmission is going to do. Because understanding the behavior is only the beginning. The root, the thing beneath the micro-behavior, beneath the reflex, beneath the management, is not a habit. It is an identity. An identity operates at a depth that behavior alone cannot reach. What you are about to encounter in the next part of this is not more description of the pattern. It is the question no one wants to sit with for very long. Who do you actually believe you are? Not in theory, not in your best moments, but In the quiet where no one is watching and you are making the real decisions? That answer is already running your life. That question doesn't stay where you put it. You can move on. You can follow the next thought, engage the next distraction, return to the rhythm of the day. But something in you already heard it, and it doesn't unhear things easily. Who do you actually believe you are? In the quiet, where the real decisions happen. Most people have never answered that question directly, not because they are avoiding it, because they have never separated it from the question of who they want to be. Those two things feel like the same question. They are not. Who you want to be lives in aspiration, in vision boards, in intentions, in the person you describe when someone asks where you're headed. Who you believe you are lives somewhere else entirely. It lives in the half-second before you respond to an unexpected opportunity. It lives in the automatic calculation you run when someone offers you something larger than what you're used to receiving. It lives in the speed at which you find reasons why this particular good thing probably won't last. That half-second, that calculation, that speed, that is identity. Not the stated version, the operational one. And the operational version is the one the field responds to. This is where the Pleiadian transmissions become uncomfortable in a very specific way, because they do not locate the problem in your circumstances. They do not locate it in your past, your wounds, your early conditioning, though all of that is real. They locate it in what you have quietly agreed to accept as normal for someone like you. Normal. That word is doing enormous work in most people's lives without them noticing. What feels normal to receive? What feels normal to ask for? What feels normal to expect when you finally do reach for something larger? Normal is not neutral. Normal is a frequency, and it has a gravitational pull, one that operates entirely beneath the level of conscious intention. You can intend forward. Normal pulls back. You can visualize the new reality. Normal quietly reasserts the coordinates of the familiar one. This is not weakness. This is coherence. The system, your system, is doing exactly what systems do, maintaining internal consistency. It is keeping you coherent with the version of yourself that has the most historical evidence behind it. And evidence to the nervous system is truth, not what is possible, what has happened before. Here is the concrete version of this. Someone decides they are ready for a different financial reality. They do the inner work, shift the language, hold the vision, and then they get an invoice wrong in their favor. Small amount, easy to overlook, and something in them, faster than thought, corrects it immediately. Not out of ethics, out of a deep cellular sense that this kind of surplus doesn't belong to them yet. Or someone is offered a promotion they are entirely qualified for, and the night before the conversation, they spend 3 hours rehearsing all the ways they might not be ready. Not because the doubt is accurate, because something needs the outcome to match the inner picture. Or someone meets a person who is genuinely available, genuinely good, genuinely interested, and within 2 weeks they have found something. Some flaw, some uncertainty, some reason to introduce distance. Because available and good doesn't match the texture of what love has historically felt like in their body. And what doesn't match the texture of the familiar gets quietly, carefully edited out. This is not a character flaw. This is a feature of how identity maintains itself. The system is not trying to hurt you. It is trying to stay legible to itself. But legibility comes at a cost. And the cost is everything that falls outside the familiar range. Every opportunity that exceeds the inner picture. Every relationship that requires a different version of you to receive it. Every version of success that your historical self has no reference for. All of it gets managed, softened, delayed, or explained away. Not dramatically, quietly, in real time, in the body. In the moment you almost said yes and said maybe instead. In the week you were supposed to send the thing and didn't open the draft. In the conversation where you had the chance to be seen fully and offered a smaller version of yourself because it felt safer. Sit with the weight of that pattern across years, across decades. It is not bad luck. It is not timing. It is not the universe withholding. It is you arriving at the edge of what your identity permits and stepping back. Not because you are broken. Because the picture hasn't been updated. The Pleiadian transmissions describe what happens when the identity picture and the desired reality are misaligned. The field receives two signals at once, one from the conscious intention, one from the deep, settled, evidenced sense of what is actually normal. And the field does not choose the louder signal. It responds to the more consistent one. Intention is momentary. Identity is continuous. And continuous wins, every time, without exception, regardless of how much effort is applied at the surface. This is the mechanics underneath every plateau, every almost, every I was so close and then. The transmission stopped not because the universe redirected it, because the deeper layer sent a correction. Here is what changes this. Not affirmations, not more visualization, not higher vibration maintained for longer. An honest renegotiation with the picture, not an attack on it, not a judgment of the person who built it, an examination, a direct look at what is actually in the frame, and a deliberate question. Does this picture still describe what is true, or only what was true once? Because most of the limits inside the picture were drawn by a version of you that had very limited information. A younger self. A self in an environment that required specific strategies to stay safe, to stay loved, to stay coherent within a system that had its own demands. That self was not wrong to build what it built, but you are not that environment anymore. And the picture does not update itself automatically. It has to be deliberately revised, not with force, but with clarity. With the willingness to look at what you have accepted as permanent that was actually only ever circumstantial. The depth of what needs examining here does not fit inside this transmission alone. What you've encountered in these two blocks is the shape of the mechanism, the behavior, the reflex, the identity layer beneath it. But the full structure, the precise architecture of how consciousness generates experience, and how that architecture can be deliberately reorganized, that requires a different level of engagement. I put together a digital book for exactly this stage of understanding. It was prepared for people who have already moved past the surface explanations, who are no longer asking whether patterns are real, but why they persist even in people who are doing the work. It is called The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness. This is not a book about motivation. It is not about wanting more or thinking positive. It is about the game, the actual structure of how consciousness and reality are in relationship, what forces are operating beneath the surface of your experience, and what it takes to shift at the level where the pattern is actually generated. The Pleiadian transmissions that inform this material do not offer comfort as a destination. They offer precision, and precision is what changes the signal at the root, not at the surface where most of the effort has been going. The link to download The Great Spiritual Game Behind Your Consciousness is in the first pinned comment below this video. If you arrived here already sensing that the standard explanations weren't reaching the actual layer, this material was prepared for that exact awareness. This understanding doesn't wait politely. The moment you see the identity layer clearly, something in you begins reorganizing, whether you consciously direct it or not. Don't let that momentum arrive without the structure to work with it. The link is there. The book is ready, and you already know whether you're at this point. Now, back into the structure of what you're actually made of, because identity is not a fixed object. It is a living process, and understanding that it is a process rather than a permanent truth about who you are is the first shift that makes everything else possible. The question is no longer who you have been. The question is what you have been organized around. And that is a fundamentally different kind of inquiry, because organization can be changed. Truth feels immovable. The moment you stop treating your identity as truth and start treating it as a current configuration, the field begins to receive a different kind of signal. Not louder, not more effortful. Different at the root, and different at the root changes the reflection entirely. That shift from truth to configuration is not intellectual. It lands in the body. You will feel it as a loosening, a small, strange sense of space where there used to be a wall. And in that space is where the next layer of this transmission lives. That loosening you just felt. Don't rush past it. Most people, the moment they sense an opening, immediately fill it with more doing, more intention setting, more planning, more action aimed at the new reality before the old architecture has actually moved. And the opening closes, not because the universe retracted it, because the same system that created the pattern rushed in to manage the unfamiliar space. This is the precise moment the Pleiadian transmissions are most specific about. They call it the collapse point, the place where genuine movement becomes available, and where the conditioned self immediately begins reconstruction, not out of malice, out of reflex. The reflex says, unknown space is danger. Fill it, organize it, make it familiar again. And so, the opening, which was actually the beginning of a different signal, gets absorbed back into the old frequency before it has a chance to transmit anything new. What the transmissions offer at this point is not more instruction. It is a lens, a specific way of perceiving what is happening in your experience, one that makes the invisible mechanics visible enough to work with. The Pleiadian consciousness does not present itself as authority over your life. It presents itself as a more precise reading instrument. Think of it this way. You have been looking at your patterns through the lens of story, narrative, cause, and effect. This happened because of that. The Pleiadian lens does not negate the story. It looks beneath it. It asks not what happened, but what was the organizing principle that made that outcome coherent, that made it, on some level, expected. Because the field does not respond to events. It responds to coherence. And your coherence, your deepest sense of internal consistency, has been running the same organizing principle for a very long time. Here is what that principle looks like from the outside. It is not a belief you can easily quote. It is a felt sense of range, a zone, a bandwidth. Within the bandwidth, familiar, manageable, the body relaxes. Outside the bandwidth, unfamiliar, suspect, the body braces. And that bracing, that quiet physical contraction, is not a response to danger. It is a response to distance from the known. The Pleiadian framework names this the coherence field, the radius of experience that your identity has validated as real and possible for you. Everything inside that radius gets drawn toward you with relative ease. Everything outside it meets an invisible resistance, not from the universe, but from your own coherent system trying to maintain its shape. This is not mysticism. This is the body doing its job. The problem is that the job was defined by a much earlier version of you, one with far less information, far less capability, operating in a much smaller world. And the body has not received a new job description. It is still protecting the coherence of a self that no longer needs that particular protection. Now here is the shift in understanding that changes everything. Most people, when they encounter this idea, immediately think, I need to push harder against the resistance, expand the bandwidth by force, stretch the coherence field outward. This is exactly the move that doesn't work. not because expansion is wrong, because force in this context is interpreted by the system as threat, and threat triggers contraction, not opening. The Pleiadian perspective is more precise than that. It says, you do not expand the coherence field by pushing against its edges. You expand it by changing what the center is organized around. Different center, different radius, different range of what feels coherent, available, and normal. This is the distinction between intensity and stability. Intensity is what most people bring to manifestation work. Concentrated effort, strong emotion, focused visualization applied at high pressure, and intensity produces results, sometimes dramatic ones. But intensity is not stable. It peaks, it drops. It requires constant reapplication. And in the gap between applications, the coherence field reasserts itself. Because the center didn't change. Only the pressure on the edges changed temporarily. Stability is different. Stability is when the new reality stops feeling like something you are reaching for and starts feeling like something that belongs within your range. Not because you forced it, because the center reorganized, because what you are internally consistent with shifted quietly at the root and the radius adjusted accordingly. This is what the transmissions mean when they say it is not about doing more, it is about stopping the contradiction. Because you can hold an intention and simultaneously hold an identity that contradicts it. And the contradiction is what collapses the signal, not the lack of effort, the internal opposition. Two things being true at once inside you. I want this. And someone like me doesn't quite get this. That second one doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't show up as doubt you can argue with. It shows up as hesitation, as the need to qualify, as the instinct to have a backup plan before the first plan has even been given room. It shows up in the way you tell the story of what you want, carefully, with exits built in, so that if it doesn't happen, you already managed your exposure. That management is the contradiction running live, and the contradiction is louder than the intention, because it has more historical weight behind it. If you're searching for the image of perfect intensity, the highest effort you've applied to wanting something, and the result still didn't arrive, or arrived and then dissolved. Look not at the effort, look at what the effort was contradicting. That is where the actual work is. Here is where this gets specific. The Pleiadian transmissions describe what they call signal clarity, the state in which what you hold consciously and what your deeper coherence field is organized around are no longer in opposition, not identical, not perfectly aligned in every dimension, simply no longer actively contradicting each other. And signal clarity does not require perfection. It does not require the complete eradication of doubt. It requires the removal of the dominant contradiction, the one that is loudest, the one with the most weight, the one that runs every time the new reality gets close enough to feel real. You know what yours is. Not abstractly, specifically, you feel it in a particular moment, in a particular kind of situation, in response to a particular quality of good thing becoming available. That specific contraction, that specific hesitation, that specific voice. That is the contradiction that needs to be examined, not managed, not overridden, not drowned out with louder affirmations. Examined, understood, brought into the conversation that the rest of you is trying to have. Because the field does not respond to volume. It responds to coherence. And coherence is only available when the parts are no longer running separate agendas. If you are reaching for the image of perfect intensity and the result still didn't arrive, look at what the effort was contradicting. Wait, that bears repeating differently. The universe is not withholding from you. You're not being punished, overlooked, or left behind. you are receiving exactly the output of your current coherence. Precisely. Without judgment, without error. The field is, in this sense, a perfect mirror. And a mirror does not lie. It only reflects what stands in front of it. The question the Pleiadian lens asks at this stage is not, how do I want more? It is, what am I currently coherent with? And is that still what I choose? Not what do you wish were true. What is your system actually organized around? Right now, in the body, in the reflex, in the half second before the conscious mind arrives to manage the response. That is the reading the lens provides. And that reading, once you have it, is not discouraging. It is liberating, because what is organized can be reorganized. What was built around outdated information can be rebuilt with current information. What the nervous system learned as permanent can be unlearned, not through force, not through years of suffering, but through the specific kind of clarity that makes the old coherence simply no longer convincing. Not fought, not suppressed, seen through. That is what the Pleiadian transmissions produce when they land correctly. Not elevated emotion, not spiritual charge. A precision that makes the old story stop feeling like truth and start feeling like what it always was. A picture, built at a specific time, serving a specific function, no longer required. The synthesis of what that means for how you move, how you relate, how you receive, how you stop contradicting what you actually want, that is what the next part of this transmission is for. Seeing through the picture is not the same as being free of it. That distinction matters, and most frameworks skip it entirely. You can understand the mechanism with complete clarity and still feel the pull of the old coherence in your body the next morning. Understanding is cognitive. Reorganization is cellular. And the cellular layer moves on a different timeline than the intellectual one. This is not a problem. It is simply the actual terrain. The Pleiadian transmissions are precise about this. The moment of seeing is not the moment of completion. It is the moment the work becomes real, because now you are operating with open eyes inside a system that still has momentum. And momentum is the part nobody talks about. Your coherence field has been running in the same direction for years, possibly decades. Even after the insight, even after the recognition, the system continues in the direction it was already moving. Not out of stubbornness, out of physics. A current doesn't stop the moment you name it. It continues until something actually redirects it. And redirection is not a single event. It is a sustained choice, made again and again, in the specific moments where the old coherence reasserts itself. Those moments are not failures. They are the texture of actual change. But here is where something shifts in how you hold them. Before the insight, those moments felt like evidence that you were broken, stuck, fundamentally limited in some way you couldn't fix. After the insight, they are feedback. Information about where the old coherence is still active, where the contradiction is still running, where the work still has a layer to address. That shift in interpretation is not small. It changes the emotional cost of the process entirely, because shame is expensive. It consumes the energy that reorganization actually needs. And most people who have been in this work for a long time are carrying tremendous shame about the fact that they still struggle with the things they have studied for years. They know the concepts, they can name the mechanisms, they have done the inner work, and the pattern still surfaces, and the shame of that surfaces with it, compounding the difficulty. The transmissions address this directly. They do not say, try harder. They do not say, you are not committed enough. They say, the presence of the old pattern is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of incomplete reorganization. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. Incomplete reorganization is a practical problem with a practical direction. Failure is a story about who you are. And stories about who you are feed directly back into the coherence field. Which means the shame is not just emotionally painful. It is structurally counterproductive. It keeps generating evidence of the exact thing you're trying to move beyond. Because the coherence field doesn't distinguish between what you fear and what you want. It responds to what has weight, to what is repeated, to what the system treats as real. And shame-soaked repetition of the pattern, in memory, in self-narration, in the story of "this is what always happens to me," is some of the heaviest material in the field. Stop. Feel the weight of that in your own life. How much of your current coherence field is built not from original events, but from the accumulated repetition of the story about those events? The original wound was significant, but the story about the wound, the version that has been retold internally thousands of times as evidence of who you are, that story has more structural weight than the original event. And it is still being told, not consciously, most of the time, in the background, in the framing you apply automatically, in the way you introduce your situation to yourself. The internal monologue that begins every new attempt with the weight of every previous outcome. This is the layer that has not yet been reorganized in most people doing serious inner work. Not because they lack commitment, because this layer is not addressed by techniques that target thought or behavior. It requires something different. A direct examination of the internal account itself, not just the events it describes, but the function it is serving. Because the story of your limitations is not just a description, it is a justification. It explains to the system why the current configuration is logical, why the coherence field is organized where it is, why expansion carries the particular risks it seems to carry. Take that justification away, and the system has no argument for staying where it is. Leave it in place, and every new technique gets absorbed into the same structure. Metabolized, neutralized, incorporated without actually changing the center. The Pleiadian transmissions describe this as the loop of sophisticated stasis, where a person has accumulated so much understanding of their own pattern that the understanding itself becomes the architecture of the limitation. Knowing exactly why you are the way you are, having full insight into the mechanism, and using that insight unconsciously as the reason the change is taking so long. As if understanding the depth of the root explains the delay in the flower. It does not. It only does if the understanding is being used as a ceiling rather than a foundation. Here is the distinction with precision. Understanding the root as foundation, the insight clears the reason for the coherence field to remain where it is. The system receives new information. The center begins to reorganize. The range expands. Understanding the root as ceiling, the insight becomes the new story. I have this deep wound, this complex history, this layered mechanism, and that story becomes the most sophisticated version yet of why things are the way they are. Both are possible. Both happen constantly in people who are earnest about their development. The difference is subtle and consequential, and it lives in one place. What do you do with the understanding the moment after it arrives? Do you let it dissolve the story, or do you incorporate it into a more detailed version of the same story? That choice is the actual fork in the road, not the insight itself. What you do with it in the following hours, days, and decisions. Because the coherence field responds not to moments of clarity, but to sustained direction. And sustained direction is built from small choices, made repeatedly, in the body, in real time. The choice to respond to the old pull without following it. The choice to receive the good thing without immediately explaining why it probably won't last. The choice to let someone see you at the full scale of what you want, without editing it down to a size that requires less vulnerability. These are not dramatic choices. They don't feel like transformation when you make them. They feel uncomfortable. Small, like you're doing something slightly wrong by not managing the situation the way you usually do. That discomfort is not a warning. It is the sensation of the coherence field meeting its edge and being asked to move. This is what the transmissions call active reorganization, the lived practice of choosing the new coherence before it feels natural, not forcing, not performing, not pretending the old pull isn't there, acknowledging it and not following it. There is a specific quality of attention required for this, not intense, not strained, something closer to steady, a settled awareness that can observe the pull without being recruited by it. The Pleiadian framework calls this witnessing with weight, being present enough to see the mechanism activate and grounded enough to respond from the new center instead of the old one. Not because the old center has disappeared, because you're no longer locating yourself there. That relocation from the old center to the new is not a single event. It is an ongoing orientation, and the more consistently it is maintained, the more the coherence field reorganizes around the new location, until eventually the new range stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like home. Not in a single morning, not from one insight, not even from months of intention. From the accumulated direction of all the small choices, held with enough consistency that the field finally has more evidence of the new coherence than the old. And here is what that feels like when it starts to happen. It is not fireworks. It is not a sudden rush of abundance or dramatic external shift. It is a quiet recognition, almost unremarkable, that something is different in the body when you approach the things that used to trigger the old contraction. The contraction is less automatic. The hesitation is slightly shorter. The reach comes before the management does. Small, cellular, precise. That is the signal of actual reorganization, and it compounds, quietly, consistently, without announcement, until the reflection in the field begins to look like something that was built deliberately, not from luck, not from force, but from the sustained coherence of a self that finally stopped contradicting what it came here to receive. The next transmission takes this further, not into more mechanics, but into what becomes possible once the contradiction has been removed. What a life organized around coherent intention actually looks like, not as a vision board, not as a goal statement, but as a lived texture that your body begins to recognize as its natural range. That is where this has been heading from the first sentence. What becomes possible once the contradiction is removed is not what most people imagine. They imagine relief, a sudden lightness, the feeling of finally arriving somewhere they have been trying to reach for years. And sometimes there is a version of that, but it is quieter than expected. What actually changes first is not the external landscape, it is the internal weather. The chronic low-grade tension of wanting something and simultaneously bracing against it. That tension lifts, and in the space it leaves, something becomes audible that was always there beneath the noise of the contradiction. Not a new voice, the original one, the one that knew what it wanted before the system learned to manage it down to a survivable size. That voice does not shout. It does not announce itself with certainty or drama. It simply becomes the loudest thing in the room, because the competing noise has finally quieted. This is the first sign that the coherence field has actually shifted. What you want stops feeling dangerous, not safe in a passive, resigned way. Safe in the sense of, this belongs within my range. This is available to someone like me. Not as a hope, as a settled fact. The body knows the difference between those two things instantly. Hope has a reaching quality to it, a slight lean forward, a held breath. Settled fact has a different texture entirely, a stillness, a quiet readiness. When the want begins to carry that texture, the signal has changed at the root, and the field responds to root level change with a precision that surface level effort never achieves. Not because the universe has been persuaded, because the broadcast is finally coherent. Now here is what must be said clearly, without the softening that most transmissions apply at this stage. The process described across this entire transmission, recognition, identity, contradiction, reorganization, is not a linear sequence you complete once. It is a living relationship with yourself, with the field, with the parts of you that were formed under conditions that no longer exist. And that relationship requires the same thing all real relationships require: sustained, honest attention. Not constant effort. Honest attention. The difference matters enormously. Effort is what you apply when you are fighting something. Honest attention is what you bring when you are working with something. And the shift from fighting your own coherence field to working with it. That is the reorganization in its most mature form. Not overriding the old signal, understanding it well enough that it no longer needs to run. Because the mechanisms that generated your limitations were not your enemies. They were earlier versions of intelligence, responses built for real conditions in real environments, with the real information available at the time. They deserve to be seen clearly, not dramatized, not vilified, not endlessly excavated. Seen, understood, and then released from their original assignment, because the assignment is complete. The conditions that required them have passed, and you are not obligated to keep paying the cost of protection you no longer need. This is the synthesis that the Pleiadian transmissions arrive at. Not as a conclusion, but as a threshold. The patterns were never random. The loops were never punishment. They were the logical output of a coherence field organized around the most reasonable interpretation available at the time. And now you have a different interpretation, a more precise one that locates the source of the pattern not in fate, not in the universe's indifference, not in some fundamental flaw in who you are, but in a picture, built in a specific time, serving a specific function, no longer required. That is the clarity that cannot be unfelt once it has arrived. Not because it is comfortable, because it is true. And truth at that level does not need to be maintained. It does not need to be revisited every morning to stay active. It reorganizes the ground you stand on, and the ground stays reorganized. What you build from that ground is different, not because you are trying harder, because you're no longer contradicting what you're building. Every reach is clean, every signal is coherent, every moment of receiving is met without the reflex to manage it back down to the familiar. This is not a destination, it is a way of operating. And once it becomes your way of operating, the external reflection shifts, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, cumulatively, in the direction of what is actually true about what you are capable of receiving. Here is the thing about this transmission that I want to say before we close. It began with a question about coincidence, about whether the patterns in your life are random or structured. The answer, as it turns out, is neither coincidence nor fate in the way those words are usually meant. It is process. Structured, logical, responsive, organized by the internal coherence you have been carrying, mostly without knowing it, for most of your life. And the moment that becomes real to you, not as an idea but as a lived recognition, the relationship with your own experience changes completely. You stop being a passenger in a story that happens to you. You become the coherence behind the story, not in the inflated, performative sense, in the quiet, practical, irreversible sense. That shift from passenger to source is what this entire transmission has been moving toward. not from the outside in, from the inside out, where it was always going to have to come from. Nothing outside you was ever the reason the pattern persisted, and nothing outside you is required to change it. The field responds to what is actually broadcast. It always has. It always will. And you have now seen enough of the mechanism to broadcast something different. That is not inspiration. That is a change in the structure of what is possible. What you do with that change? In the next hour, the next decision, the next moment you feel the pull of the old coherence. That is where the transmission becomes real. Not in the listening, in what follows it. This was never really about what is arriving from elsewhere. It was always about what you have been, until now, unable to clearly see in yourself. The link is in the first pinned comment below this video. This kind of material, the kind that maps the actual structure of what most people are told to simply accept, rarely stays available without interference. What is written there challenges accounts that many have a significant interest in keeping unexamined. There have been attempts before to quiet this knowledge. That is not speculation. If you are here, you did not arrive by accident. The moment you are in is not preliminary to the right moment. It is the right moment. Read it with the same quality of presence you brought to this transmission. And if something in those pages confirms what you have always sensed but never seen named with this precision, leave one word in the comments below. That word is awake. No explanation needed. The ones who are ready already know what it means.